You're about to discover some of the creepiest info about Greece that will make your stomach churn. Prepare your ears to hear gross details like a random person chewing gracefully on your earwax, while the look of disgust fills your face. Have it in mind that their weird acts were quite justifiable to them. To find out what these acts were, keep watching. The ancient Greeks didn't just go to the gym. They turned it into a full-blown spectacle. Forget the lycra, tank tops, or even shorts when Greek men exercised. They ditched every stitch of clothing. That's right. They worked out completely naked. And if that wasn't already awkward enough, they took things a step further by slathering themselves in oil beforehand. This wasn't just for aesthetics, though their sculpted physiques were certainly admired. The oil served a purpose. It reduced friction, prevented dirt from sticking, and added a nice shiny glow to those rippling muscles. Picture a modern gym, except instead of sweat-soaked shirts, you'd find glistening, oiled-up bodies doing push-ups and wrestling in their birthday suits. The Greeks were obsessed with the human form, particularly the male physique. They believed that the body was a gift from the gods, and that showing it off naturally was a way of celebrating divine perfection. Modesty wasn't exactly on their list of virtues, but there was also a practical side to nudity. Clothes got in the way of movement, and honestly, who wanted to deal with washing sweaty tunics? Naked workouts became so iconic that the word gymnasium comes from the Greek word gymnasium, meaning school for naked exercise. So, if you're ever feeling self-conscious at the gym, just be thankful you're not in ancient Greece. After an intense session of running, wrestling, or weightlifting, yes, they had weights too. These ancient gym-goers didn't just hit the showers because they weren't. Instead, they used a strigil, a curved metal scraper, to remove the oil, sweat, and dead skin from their bodies. Imagine a personal squeegee for your workout grime. But here's where things get truly bizarre. Those scrapings weren't thrown away. Oh no, they were collected. Why? Because people believed that the mixture of sweat, oil, and dead skin held mystical properties. These gym scrapings, called gloios, were sold as medicinal elixirs or ointments. Supposedly, they could cure ailments, soothe aches, and maybe even give you a hint of that legendary Greek glow. You might wonder who, in their right mind, would pay for someone else's sweat and dead skin. The answer? Lots of people. The Greeks saw athletes as near divine beings, and their bodily fluids were thought to contain a bit of their godlike essence. Imagine if someone bottled an NBA player's sweat today and sold it as a miracle cure. That's what was happening. Shalom, priests, healers, and even regular folks bought gloios for various purposes. Some used them to treat injuries, while others rubbed them on themselves, hoping to absorb the strength and vigor of the athlete they came from. It was the ultimate health product, albeit very gross by today's standards. If you thought modern society had strict views on cheating, wait until you hear about ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, infidelity was a big deal. Marriage wasn't just about love or partnership. It was a legal contract tied to family honor, inheritance, and social standing. So, when someone committed adultery, they weren't just betraying their spouse. They were trampling on the entire family's reputation, and the Greeks did not take that lightly. If the adulterer was caught in the act, the wronged party, usually the husband, had the legal right to kill him on the spot. But let's say the adulterer managed to survive being caught. If the case went to court, things didn't get better for the accused. Enter the punishment that has likely scarred more than a few imaginations: a large radish inserted into the offender's anus. Why a radish, you ask? Scholars speculate that this bizarre punishment wasn't just about physical pain, though that was certainly part of it. The radish was meant to symbolically feminize the adulterer, stripping him of his masculinity and pride. In a culture that valued male dominance and power, this was the ultimate humiliation. Now, let's pause and appreciate the absurdity of this. Somewhere in Athens, a market vendor might have sold his finest radishes to a lawyer for official business. If the radish wasn't degrading enough, the Greeks had a follow-up act: the removal of the adulterer's pubic hair using hot ash. A courtroom would be filled with onlookers as someone's hair was burned off with ash. Painful. Absolutely. Humiliating? Humiliating? Beyond belief. In ancient Greece, dying wasn't just about saying goodbye to life, but settling a very peculiar debt. According to Greek mythology, anyone who passed away had to pay Charon, the stern ferryman of the river Styx, to secure a one-way ticket to the underworld. No money, no passage. Charon was no ordinary boatman. His job was to transport the souls of the dead across the murky, treacherous waters of the river Styx to the underworld, where Hades reigned supreme. But Charon wasn't running a charity service. His price was an obol, a small coin usually placed in the mouth or near the deceased's body. The obol, worth about 1/6 of a drachma, or roughly the cost of a cheap meal back then, wasn't just a formality. It was a non-negotiable entry fee. Forget your coin. Tough luck. You'd be stuck haunting the riverbanks, aimlessly wandering for a century, while your ghostly neighbors exchanged stories of how their families forgot to include bus fare in their funeral plan. To the Greeks, this custom was deadly serious. Funeral rituals were meticulously planned to ensure a smooth journey to the afterlife. People would be buried or cremated with their obol carefully tucked into their mouths, clenched in their fists, or slipped into their graves. Imagine the awkwardness if a loved one forgot this detail. You had one job, Nikos, one job: to put the coin in Papo's mouth. Now he's wandering the Styx, crankier than ever, for the unlucky souls who couldn't pay. Eternity didn't look promising. These penniless spirits couldn't board Charon's boat and had to linger on the shores of the river Styx for 100 years. While wealthier families could afford lavish burials with plenty of obols to spare, the less fortunate faced a dire prospect: their loved ones stuck in this spectral purgatory, possibly giving them a ghostly side-eye for centuries. Let's start with the concept of pederasty. In ancient Greece, this was a socially accepted practice where an older man, usually in his 20s or 30s, the Erastes, formed a relationship with a younger male, often a teenager or even a prepubescent boy, the Eromenos. This wasn't casual. It was viewed as a mentorship that blended education, companionship, and yes, romance. The Greeks believed this relationship benefited the boy, helping him transition into adulthood. But here's the kicker: they saw this as intellectual and moral grooming, with an unsettling physical side dish. To them, this was as normal as teaching algebra or hosting a soccer practice. The Greeks had a thing for idealized beauty, and they equated youthful appearance with purity and potential. Boys were thought to be at the peak of their mental and physical charm before adulthood spoiled them. They even wrote poetry and philosophy about it. Plato's Symposium and some of Sappho's fragments praised the virtues of love between men and boys. Big thinkers like Socrates and Aristotle didn't outright condemn these relationships, meaning it wasn't just fringe behavior but mainstream. In case you're wondering, women weren't part of this picture. In ancient Greece, women were largely excluded from public life and education. They were married off young to men much older than them and expected to stay home. Meanwhile, men bonded over philosophy, politics, and their deeply problematic relationships with boys. As societies evolved, so did their moral compasses. When Rome took over, the Romans were like, "What's with these Greeks and their weird relationships?" While Roman culture wasn't exactly a model of virtue, They drew the line at normalizing pederasty, with the rise of things drastic. Christian teachings condemned pedophilic practices, and the idea of relationships between men and boys shifted from mentorship to outright sin. By the Middle Ages, the concept was largely a relic of a much older and creepier world. Imagine being a doctor in ancient Greece. You don't have fancy lab equipment, modern diagnostic tools, or the internet to look things up. So, what's a doctor to do when faced with a patient who's sick or injured? Well, one method was sampling body fluids. And no, we're not talking about a quick blood test or a urine sample you hand over to a nurse. In ancient Greece, some physicians would taste bodily fluids, like urine, to determine what was wrong with them. It's as bizarre as it sounds, but it was considered normal. One of the most famous figures in Greek medicine was Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine. His approach focused on natural causes of illness, rather than attributing them to gods or supernatural force. Hippocrates and his followers relied heavily on observing bodily symptoms, such as the color of your skin, the sound of your cough, and yes, even the taste of your bodily fluid. This method of diagnosis was grounded in the belief that the body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Any imbalance among these humors could cause disease. To determine what was out of whack, physicians felt it necessary to examine fluids closely, sometimes by tasting them. Urine was the most commonly tasted fluid in ancient Greece. Why urine? Well, it was easy to get and had been used for thousands of years for diagnostic purposes in different cultures. Greek doctors believed that urine's color, smell, and taste could tell them about a person's internal humors. For instance, a sweet taste might indicate diabetes, an early form of diabetes mellitus, though the Greeks didn't know that yet. On the other hand, a bitter taste could suggest liver problems. Doctors didn't stop at urine, though. They also tasted saliva, vomit, and even mucus to make their diagnosis. This was all part of their scientific method. Despite the unusual and often gross methods, ancient Greek medicine laid the foundation for many medical practices we use today. The Greeks taught us the importance of observation, diagnosis, and a holistic view of health. Infanticide refers to the act of killing an infant, usually within the first year of its life. In ancient Greece, this was something that could happen for various reasons, including the child being born with defects, the family being unable to care for the child, or simply because the child was unwanted due to societal norms. I know what you're thinking. Why would anyone do such a thing? Well, let's break it down. The most common form of infanticide in ancient Greece wasn't done with violent intent, but through a known as exposure. Exposure was when a child, often left in a public space like a hillside or a forest, was abandoned to die. Babies who were deemed unfit due to deformities, gender, or just poor economic circumstances were abandoned in this way, often with little chance of survival. While it sounds heartless, the Greeks didn't think of it as murder. They believed it was a form of cleansing their society of those who couldn't contribute. There were a few reasons why infanticide was an acceptable practice in ancient Greece. Let's start with the practical ones. 1. Families back then had to be able to support every member. If a family was poor or had too many children, raising another child could push them to the brink of starvation. Killing the infant or abandoning it was seen as an unfortunate but necessary action to ensure the survival of the rest of the family. It wasn't cruelty. It was about survival. Secondly, Greek society was heavily patriarchal. Boys were valued more than girls, and a disabled or deformed child was seen as a burden. Only the strongest, healthiest males were expected to grow into warriors or philosophers, and families often chose to keep only those who could contribute to the household or society. Imagine this. You're walking through the bustling streets of Athens, minding your own business, when suddenly you come across a group of naked men casually chatting about philosophy or debating politics. Public nudity was normal for the Greeks, not just for the brave warriors or the daring athletes, but for all sorts of social occasions. The Olympics, one of ancient Greece's most iconic legacies, also embraced this tradition of public nudity. Imagine thousands of spectators at the first Olympic Games, held in 776 BCE, watching athletes sprint, jump, and wrestle all in their natural state. You wouldn't find any lycra or sports bras here. Here's where things get more interesting and complicated. While it was perfectly fine for men to strut around in the buff, things were a lot more conservative when it came to women. Public nudity for women was not the norm, except during certain religious rituals or festivals, where they might participate in the worship of deities, like Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, or Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. If you think public nudity was confined to athletic arenas, think again. Ancient Greek art and philosophy also held nudity in high regard. Sculptures, like the famous Discobolus, the discus thrower, and Venus de Milo, depict idealized, muscular bodies in a completely nude state, symbolizing perfection in form and spirit. First, let's meet the real healer of ancient Greece, Asclepius, the god of medicine. Imagine the Greek version of a superhero, but instead of a cape, he had a staff wrapped with a snake, the symbol of healing even today. People didn't just visit their local doctor for a quick checkup. They made pilgrimages to Asclepius's temples, called Asclepia, which were ancient spas and hospitals combined. Now, you'd think you'd walk into one of these temples and get some sage advice on your diet or a potion for your headache. But no, Asclepius wasn't the type to hand out prescriptions. People believed that if they slept in the temple, the god would appear in their dreams and heal them. The Greeks often turned to incantations and spells to heal the sick. Priests or healers would recite words to ward off evil spirits they believed were causing the illness. For instance, if you have a cold, you might find yourself in a room filled with chanting, instead of just taking some honey or hot tea. The Greeks had their share of medical knowledge about plants and herbs, and weren't shy about mixing them with some magic. Famous figures like Hippocrates and Galen wrote about the use of medicinal herbs. Still, even they didn't entirely separate medicine from mysticism. The Oracle of Delphi was an ancient Greek institution that promised to offer divine insight. It was located at the Temple of Apollo, nestled at the foot of Mount Parnassus, where people from all walks of life would travel for guidance. Whether you were a king about to wage war, a merchant looking for investment advice, or just a curious soul, the Oracle was your go-to. Here's where things get interesting. The Oracle wasn't just some wise older adult sitting in a fancy chair, casually reading tea leaves. Instead, the person delivering prophecies, the Pythia, was often trance-like when giving her answers. Why? Because she was probably high. We're not talking about a cup of chamomile tea to relax. Geologists have long speculated that the oracle's prophecies were linked to naturally occurring gases that rose from underground cracks at the site. These gases, possibly ethylene or methane, would create a hallucinogenic effect, making the Pythia appear to be in a state of ecstasy or divine possession. In other words, she inhaled mystical fumes that might have made her feel connected to the gods. The question remains, why did so many people believe in these weird vapor-induced prophecies? In ancient Greece, the gods were a real part of life. Every aspect of the world, from politics to weather, was thought to be controlled by some divine force. Let's start with the crown jewel of ancient Greek blood sports, pancration. If you've ever seen MMA today, you can picture it. But trust me, this was on a whole new level of hardcore. Pancration was an all-out combat sport with very few rules. Fighters were allowed to punch, kick, choke, and even break bones. The goal? To force your opponent into submission or make them give up. The only things that weren't allowed were eye-gouging and biting. The crowds went wild for pancration. It was often a part of the Olympic Games, and the athletes, usually men, fought to win glory and survive. If you lost, there wasn't much sympathy. Think about how intense the crowds must have been, shouting and waving, not because it was a clean fight, but because they wanted to see who would walk away and who would be carried out. Some fights ended with broken limbs, dislocated joints, and even death. When we think of ancient Greece, we often picture philosophical giants like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle debating life's biggest questions while enjoying peaceful surroundings and a deep sense of wisdom. But here's a fun fact. While these brilliant minds were busy pondering the nature of existence, they were also not concerned with cleanliness. If you want an example of a Greek philosopher who took the philosophy over hygiene idea to the extreme, look no further than Diogenes of Sinope. Diogenes was the OG of I don't care what you think regarding personal hygiene. He didn't just ignore cleanliness, he rebelled against it. One of his most famous stunts involved him living in a barrel in Athens. He thought that luxuries like running water, nice clothes, and a clean house were distractions from true wisdom. His clothes were often ragged. He bathed in public, and he famously wandered around the streets with a lantern during the day, claiming to be looking for an honest man. The fact that he didn't care about hygiene was just another way to show that he was above the conventional norms of society. There was also a social component to the Greek attitude toward hygiene. In ancient Greece, bathing was often associated with luxury and leisure. The rich could afford to visit public baths, while the poor didn't have that luxury. Philosophers who rejected hygiene might have done so not just for intellectual reasons, but because it was a way of rejecting the pursuit of wealth and status. They saw bathing and cleanliness as something the elite indulged in to differentiate themselves, while the philosophers rejected these norms in favor of intellectual equality. These early scientists were the original gravediggers, unearthing corpses in the name of anatomy and medicine. Creepy, yes. Groundbreaking, absolutely. In ancient Greece, medicine was a mix of real science and mystical hocus-pocus. Doctors like Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, were determined to understand how the human body worked. The problem? Cutting open bodies to study them wasn't exactly legal or socially acceptable. Greek society valued respect for the dead, and grave digging was considered sacrilegious. But curiosity is a powerful motivator. For ambitious anatomists, a well-timed borrowing of a corpse was the only way to learn what made humans tick. After all, diagrams drawn from imagination can only take you so far. One famous figure in grave-digging science was Herophilos, a Greek physician from Alexandria. Often called the father of anatomy, Herophilos performed detailed dissections of human cadavers and even studied the nervous system. He discovered that the brain, not the heart, controlled thought and sensation. Despite the eerie methods, these early anatomical studies laid the foundation for modern medicine. What do you think? Genius or just plain gory? Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to our channel. See you next time.